about time to begin. If you will, take a song book, turn to number 824. 824. Sing the first and the last verse. Some glad morning when this life is o'er, I'll fly away to our home on God's celestial shore. I'll fly away. I'll fly away, oh glory. I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away. Just a few more weary days and then I'll fly away to a land where joy shall never end. I'll fly away. I'll fly away, oh glory, I'll fly away. When I die, hallelujah, by and by, I'll fly away. Song before prayer will be number 850. 850. 850. Father, I adore you, and I lay my life before you. Oh, how I love you, Jesus, I adore you, and I lay my life before you. Oh, how I love you, Spirit, I adore you, and I lay my life before you. Oh, how I love you. Let's pray. Lord Heaven, we thank you for this day and its many blessings. Lord, we thank you for allowing us to come together and worship today your word. Lord, we pray you be with those that are leading us today in services. We pray that everything will be done and said in accordance with your will. We pray you will be with those mentioned as sick, that their health may be returned to them. Lord, we pray that we'll be attentive today and take something home with us that we may use in our lives. In Christ's name, amen. We'll go ahead and mark the invitation song will be number 800. 800, number 800. Sing that after Barry speaks to us. And before that, we'll sing number 93. 93. If you'd like, we can stand at this time. Right.
Christ for the world we sing. The world to Christ we bring with loving zeal. The poor and them that mourn, the faint and overborne, sin sick and sorrow worn, to Christ appeal. Christ for the world we sing. The world to Christ we bring with loveful song. The newborn souls whose days reclaim from error's ways, inspired with hope and praise, to Christ belong. You see.
Open your Bibles to Genesis chapter 16. Genesis 16. Continuing to take our walk through the book of Genesis. This chapter. And I hope you're enjoying this. I've heard a lot of positive comments. I know it's been a good study for me. I've been enjoying it. But the difficulty with it is some of these chapters lend themselves more so to lessons than they do sermons. Trying to preach them gets a little bit difficult and tedious at times. And so this is one of those that goes along those lines, but I think it's really fitting that if we look at it, you see in your handout, the title I've given this chapter is God Doesn't Need Our Help, Just Our Trust. Have you ever felt that you needed to help God out with His plans? It's a natural thing sometimes. We get caught up in that a little bit. And most of the time, I would dare say, it comes from a good intention, right? You want to do what's right. You want to please God. You want to be acceptable to God. God has a plan, and you've heard that many times. And what's God's plan for your life? I know there have been many times in my life where I was really kind of hoping at times He would send some fiery pillar to say, follow that, and that's the way you need to go, and maybe help me out a little bit along the lines. And He's not going to do that. He's given us His word. And that's something we take for granted many times today. We want some feeling to lead us. We want some gesture to lead us. We want some spark, something exciting. As we said in the Bible class earlier, he was bringing up like Naaman. When Naaman he's dealing with leprosy, he goes to Elisha, and Elisha doesn't even come out and speak to him. I mean, he's brought pomp and circumstance with all of his gold and everything that he brings along, his little caravan that he has. I'm going to pay him to do this. Help me get rid of this leprosy. Go dip in the Jordan River 7 times, you'll be clean. Behold, I thought there'd be more to it than this. No, the word said, go do this, go do it. Do you want to be healed or not? That's the real question. Do you want to be saved or not? Do you really want to do God's will or not? We need to listen to His word. So we have felt that probably at times with the good intentions. I want to fulfill my role and do what God wants me to do. I want people to be saved. I got to do my part. And we get into all of this, and sometimes we think we've got to help God out with His plans when all He said to do is trust Him. Doesn't mean you don't do anything. That's the other extreme. That we go to extremes sometimes. And if you look at it, there are many times we'll go to an extreme to try to prove that we're not an extremist. You've got to be careful with those things. But nevertheless, even some of the greatest examples of faith found themselves struggling with this same problem as we see in this text we're going to be looking at today. Genesis 16 is a prime example of that. The idea that I need to help God out instead of trusting God. And that's what I want us to focus on as we look at this chapter and consider how God doesn't need our help, just our trust. Look at chapter 16. We're going to notice first in our first point, Roman numeral number 1, verses 1 through 6, Sarah thought that she had to help God out. Let's look at that from verses 1 through 6. Now Sarah, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had an handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. And Sarah said unto Abram, Behold, now the Lord hath restrained me from bearing. I pray thee, go in unto my maid, that it may be that I may obtain children by her. And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarah. And Sarah, Abram's wife, took Hagar, her maid, the Egyptian, after Abram had dwelt 10 years in the land of Canaan, and gave her to her husband Abram to be his wife. He went in to unto Hagar, and she conceived, and when she saw she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her eyes. And Sarah said unto Abram, My wrong be upon thee. I have given my maid into thy bosom. And when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her eyes. The Lord judge between me and thee. But Abram said unto Sarah, Behold, thy maid is in thy hand. Do to her as it pleaseth thee. And Sarah dealt hardly with her when she fled from her face. Sarah thought she had to help God out. Now, first, we learn of Sarah being barren. They understood something. Now, in the mixed assembly as we are today, I'll take the high road on this, but there have been some throughout the years that think that intimate relationship between a husband and wife is solely for procreation. To that I answer, how did Abram know that Sarah was barren? Many years. Okay? God blesses that. Marriage is honorable and all in the bed, and we know what that means, undefiled. Where? In the marriage. Outside of that, whoremongers and adulterers God will judge. Anything outside of that relationship is taboo, off limits, and sinful. But we first learn in our reading of this situation that she was barren from Genesis chapter 11, verse 30. But God had told Abram, and I'm going to do that again. I'm going to go ahead and reference that. I'm going to say Abram and Abraham probably throughout this. I'm trying to stay with these Abram still right now. But if I say Abraham, it's the same guy. You know who we're talking about. So God had told Abram that the seed would come how? Back in chapter 15, we looked at last Sunday. It would come through his body. Right? That's a good translation of that. King James says from his own loins. From his, or bowels rather. From his body. It's going to be his child. Okay? He may have thought early on that it's going to be Lot. That's a relative of mine. Then he thought, well, I've got Eleazar, who was born in my house, a servant. He's the only heir. He's the one who's going to be in charge of my affairs when I'm gone. That's how it's set up as it is right now. But God said, no, that's not the way it's going to work. It's going to be your child. Now, hold on to that thought, because we're talking about Sarah at this point, right? Not Abraham. We're talking about Sarah. Sarah was some 75 years old at this point. So she's getting up there as well. Now, I know they lived a lot longer at that point, but still, they felt the hopelessness in this situation, and Sarah herself, no doubt, felt the hopelessness of her part in the plan. Wouldn't you agree with that? She, no doubt, they would talk. God told me that I'm going to have a child, Sarah. I can't do it. We've been trying all this time. I can't have children. I'm not going to be part of this plan. So she comes up and she concocts a plan to use her maiden waiting, Hagar. The word in the Hebrew, shipcha, means a servant, a slave, or a maid in waiting. And that's the reference that is used here in this text when we're talking about Hagar. It says this handmaid there, this Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. When he emphasizes Egyptian, and it does it twice in this text, in these first 6 verses, when he emphasizes Egyptian, what do you think comes to mind? Could this possibly be one of the things that Pharaoh gave to Abram when he left? You remember the scene we talked about earlier on when Abram says to Sarah, tell Pharaoh you're my sister. That way he won't kill me and take you as his wife. Well, he sends them out with great spoils. He sends them out giving them things. It's very possible, and many commentators agree with that she could have likely have been one of the gifts that Pharaoh had given to Abram, a servant and this handmaid, Hagar, possibly from chapter 12, verse 16. But it references Sarah here as well as being Abram's wife. That's a different Hebrew word. Totally different Hebrew word. Ishak is one of that. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly. If you were looking at the English pronunciation, it would be Eeshah. But when you're talking Hebrew, you clear your throat a little bit. So be careful with those in which company. Nevertheless, this is a different word. And it references, of course, her being his wife. And this pronouns word that we talked about earlier is used the very first time back in Genesis chapter 2, verse 23, in reference to Eve. And it's used the same way when it refers to her, she shall be called woman. But also, shall a man leave his father and be cleaved to his father and mother and be cleaved to his wife. In that same context, it's the same word. It's interesting. I just found that quite interesting. It's the value that is being placed upon her in this position versus the situation that we see with Hagar, which is kind of, we would say, demeaning, wouldn't you agree? It's belittling someone. It's subservient. She has little choice in the situation. And so it could be, as you look at this situation, she decides, okay, I'm not involved in this. I can't be involved in this, but there's a way I can be involved. In the culture that they were living in, I have this servant, I have this handmaid, and I can give this handmaid to my husband because I can't have children, and if she has a child, that becomes my child. And maybe this is how God's going to work it out. She's reasoning with herself. What's she not doing? Asking God about it. She leaves him out of the picture. Though she's trying with good intentions, I'll give her the high road there. She's trying to help this happen. I know, Abram, you told me, God said you're going to have a child. I can't help you, but I'm your wife. So here's how we're going to do this. And of course, as we read there, Abram hearkens to her. But what was the end result? Could it be maybe on a little bit more of a negative connotation that she somewhat blamed God? Think about that. Look at the text again. It said, verse 2, Sarah said unto Abram, behold, now, what? The Lord hath restrained me. I can't bear children, and whose fault is that? We sometimes can do that. Get caught up in the emotions of this would be a very emotional, very trying thing for her. I can't give you a child. I can't produce an heir. I can't give you a man-child specifically. So her plan that she conducts, again, it goes back to the culture and the society around her. I came across this. It's quite interesting. In the 5th century, there was a text called the Nuzi text. And it said this, that a wife from a prominent family who was unable to bear children had the option of getting a concubine for her husband from the Louvre. Yeah, or I want to say Lulu, but it's Lulluu. And it goes on in parentheses, where the choicest slave girls were found. They had a place reserved. This is where you get the best concubines. I wonder if Solomon knew about that. The idea here goes back goes on and says, to bear her husband children in her place. Listen to this. The child born to that union would be reckoned as her child and would have legal rights as a legitimate offspring of the marriage. So what does that say? Here's our word, legal. But it's not what? Scriptural. Those are not always the same thing. Often totally opposites of each other. Look at our society today. The divorce rate in our society today. It's legal, but it's not scriptural. Look at many relationships that are entered into with marriage because of an unscriptural divorce. They're legal, but they're not scriptural. She left God out of the plan with this. But as you look at the text, and you continue reading, and as you already pointed out, that Abram hearkened unto her like Adam in the beginning, you've got Abram hearkening to his wife and not to the Lord. I'm not leaving Abram out of this picture. Abram kind of takes a hands-off approach to this. Hey, you told me to do this. You see to this. But nevertheless, it does seem kind of connected and you go back to Genesis chapter 3, verse 17, how that Adam ate, he was with his wife. She gave to her husband with her. He did eat. Why did he not say no? Why did he not say, Eve, no, we're not doing this? He hearkened to her. I am not saying that I don't listen to my wife at times. I can't. My son's sitting right there. He's seen it. But this would be a time when I'd have to tell my wife no. What man in his right mind would think that this is going to work out in the end? Okay, I picked on the men first, but what woman in her right mind thought this was going to be okay? Sarah, in the moment. Sarah, in the moment. So in a sense, one author says, in a sense, Abraham reenacted the fall of man. Instead of trusting God and following his word, he listened to his wife and obeyed her instructions, hear it, with heart-rending results. I dare say we still reap some of the benefits, or that's a bad word, I guess, to use that, some of the consequences of that action, even in our societies that we have today. Is there a lot of peace and harmony between the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Isaac? Not a lot of harmony there, is it? Even though they really can't trace totally their lineage anymore. It's interesting. But nevertheless, Hagar, verse 3, had no choice in this, did she? Sarah said, this is what's going to happen. She talks about it with Abram, but Hagar, how sad is that? She's a concubine. There's a Hebrew word for that. But she's also referred to as, in this text, Abram's wife. Look at the end of verse 3. It says, she gave to her husband, Abram, to be his wife. That's that same word again. She's going to be a wife to him. Now, having said that, she is one of only 3 in the Old Testament that are referred to as both a concubine in that sense and a wife, using the same terminology. The next one would be over in chapter 25, verses 1 through 6, and that's Keturah. The other would be Bilhah in chapter 30, verses 4 and 35, chapter 35, verse 22. But what would happen? Verse 4, there's going to be a rivalry that's going to result as of this decision. There's going to be a strife and a conflict. Rivalry, resentment, instability should have been expected in polygamous marriages, and we have other examples of that as well. If you go over to chapter 29, verse 30, you've got Rachel and Leah. They were sisters, but they had problems as a result later on. They had strife and conflict with each other later on. Chapter 30, verse 8 as well. She would say she was despised by her sister. Rachel was loved. Leah was giving him children. How sad. There's a lot of questions that we could bring up about that situation, but we know ultimately this was never part of God's plan, was it? Multiple wives. Jesus makes that clear, doesn't he, in the New Testament? From the beginning, it wasn't so. From the very beginning, God didn't create Adam and take several of his ribs and make several women so he could have a flavor of the wheat. That's harsh, isn't it? Yes, but that's how it has become with some people in our society today. No, he gave him one wife. They were to be together for life. And so there's examples of the problems with this. But there's a word in verse 5 that I want you to consider as well. It says, and Sarah said unto Abram, my wrong. My wrong. Wrong, chamas is the Hebrew word that's used there. It means violence. Carries a connotation of violence. Is Sarah saying to Abram that Hagar's laying hands on me? No. But what is happening in this despisal that she feels from Hagar, she interprets that as violence. She interprets it in that way. Her actions as a violent, hateful, showing of disrespect. She accuses her to her husband of just that. Why would that happen? Could it be that Hagar maybe felt a little moment, she knows who she is. She knows that she was property, right? She was given to Abram and Sarah. She's Sarah's handmaid. She's her servant. She's told to do this. But now, I can do something you can't do. I can give your husband a child. You can't do that. Well, no, women don't do that kind of thing. They wouldn't do that, would they? Do we have an example of that? We have another example of that in 1 Samuel, don't we? Chapter 1. Niah, Elkanah's other wife. Hannah, of course, later on is the mother of Samuel. She couldn't have children. And what happened? Niah, the other wife, she constantly railed on her. She did so because she felt the sting of rejection from Elkanah, that he loved Hannah more than he did her. But she was giving him children. She was giving him offspring. And so the only thing she could do is take it out on Hannah. Another example of why it was never part of God's plan. It breeds violence, rivalry, resentment, instability. Sarah charges Abram in this, though, and this is one of the things that I think is quite interesting. And again, don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I still say Abram, he could have said, no, I'm not doing this. He could have been just like Job when Job's wife told him, curse God and die. He could have said, Sarah, you speak like one of the foolish right now. And should have, amen? But he didn't. Having said that, listen to this. And Sarah said unto Abram, my wrong be upon you. She starts out okay. No, she don't, because she's saying, what I'm feeling, this resentment, this hateful attitude that's being thrown on me by Hagar, this is your fault. Now, some have speculated. Now, I say speculated because the text doesn't tell us this. Could be, I give some credence to it, it's quite possible that Abram's lack of addressing this may have shown a little bit of approval. Maybe he was showing a little bit of, she did get the job. It's possible, but it doesn't seem the case. All I know is she says, this is on you. Abram, you better fix this. And I'm going to call on a higher power for vindication. God judge between you and me. Can't help it. Open mouth, insert foot. But most husbands right then would say, what? Y'all got your wives sitting beside you, so you don't want to say it. Woman, this was your idea. How would that work out? You want to say it, but it wouldn't work out very well, would it? Abram does show a little wisdom in this. He does show a little bit of wisdom as we continue. But verse 6, he turns the matter over to Sarah. So this is going to show Sarah something. You're my wife. You're my primary. You're my one. You're my love. You see to it. It's in your control. Now, quite possibly, could Abram have thought, well, this was her idea. It hasn't worked out the way she thought it was going to work out, so maybe she'll deal a little graciously with Hagar, considering this was all started because of her choice. She didn't practice the golden rule, did she? Treat people the way you want to be treated. She was practicing I think it's the iron rule, treat people the way you want to be treated. She went off on it. Same idea here, that violent concept. They're not saying that when she dealt hardly with her, it means to force, to punish, or to inflict pain. It was the same as was used in Exodus chapter 1, verses 11 through 12. And that was the sense of Pharaoh persecuting God's people. I'm not saying that she physically did things to her, but she caused her enough pain to do what? She caused her and inflicted enough pain and punishment on her that she left. She fled from the presence of Abram and Sarah to head back into the wilderness, which is, desert, headed back toward Egypt. Sarah's choice, her choice to help God, did not have the results that she hoped. What was the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal was fulfilling God's promise that through Abram's seed, all nations would be blessed. He would have a son of his own body, She couldn't provide that. Hagar, my handmaid, would do it, but he will be my son. Ishmael, hear this, never was her son. This didn't work out. He was legally, but never was her son. Nor was he the seed that God would use through whom the Messiah would come. God didn't need Sarah's help. He needed her trust. The same is true for us today. Number 2, verses 7 through 14. Hagar. What about Hagar? Sarah thought she needed to help God. Hagar thought she had no help at all. This is really a sad situation. God exalts her, as we see later on. But look at verses 7 through 14 quickly. And the angel of the Lord found her by the fountain of water in the wilderness, or desert, by the fountain in the way to Shur. And he said, Hagar, Sarah's maid, whence comest thou, and whither wilt thou go? She said, I flee from the face of my mistress Sarah. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Return to thy mistress, and submit thyself unto her. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, I will multiply thy seed exceedingly, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. And the angel of the Lord said unto her, Behold, thou art with child, and shalt bear a son, and shalt call his name Ishmael, because the Lord hath heard thy affliction. He will be a wild man, and his hand will be against every man, and every man's hand will be against him, and he shall dwell in the presence of all his brethren. And she called the name of the Lord that spake unto her, Thou, God, seest me. For she said, Have I also here looked after him that seeth me? Wherefore the well is called Beer-lahai-roi. Behold, it is between Kadesh and Beer. Now, this sad situation in the beginning has a better outcome later on, but it starts with referencing the concept of the angel of the Lord. And that's an interesting study. Some 58 times in the Old Testament, this idea of angel of the Lord, which means messenger or authority of God, or God himself even at times can be referenced as this. Exodus chapter 3, when you see Moses at the burning bush, no angel being a messenger of God is worthy of telling someone, take off your shoes because my presence makes this holy ground. Only one can do that. I believe that it's fitting that Jesus, or the Word, the second person of the Godhead, would be the one to whom Moses was speaking from the burning bush. I think that bears worthy of our study and consideration. But nevertheless, angel of the Lord, messenger, authority of God, or God himself. That's the idea. This was a great blessing that was given to Hagar in her destitute situation to be able to have this message. Remember again, who is she? She's an Egyptian. She's not one of the Israelites, as we would call them, not a Hebrew, as we would call them. She's a slave given to Abram and his people from Egypt. So this would be a great blessing for her to have this message showing that God is concerned about her. She's going into the wilderness, going towards Shur, the desert of Shur. Shur means wall. That's its original connotation. It may be, one author said, may be referring to the line of forts guarding the border of Egypt against Asiatics, chapter 25:18. We have an example of that. But if you look at the situation, if you look at what she's actually doing, this is a very foolish thing for her to do. Or maybe let me put it that way. This is a very desperate thing. She's left the presence of Abram. Now, okay, wait a minute. How is that foolish? She's being given as a wife. She's been mistreated here. How is it a good thing for her to stay with Abram? Do you remember what God promised Abram? I will bless those who bless you. Do we lose that? Is this not a prime example of God keeping his word? I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to take care of your son. Self-preservation, though, is this hopelessness that she was feeling. Is why she left. Why would anybody go into the desert? She felt that was better than what she had. But it was a hopeless situation for her in her mind. Verse 8, you have a rhetorical question that's given, God not know where she was going? Did God not know what she was doing? Of course he did. He asked this rhetorical question of what purpose then? To get her to rethink her choice. Rethink what you're doing. Rethink the consequences of this decision going into the facing of Belial. He tells her in verse 9 then to return and submit. Return and submit. That's far better than certain death that's going to be awaiting her. God knew that as well in the wilderness. Verse 10, he gives her a promise. Did you notice something in this promise in verse 10? It sounded familiar. Isn't it very similar to what he promised Abraham? Descendants. He told on one occasion, we talked about earlier, how you look at the stars. Can you count the stars? So will be your descendants. Like the sand of the seashore, innumerable. But what did he say to Hagar? I will multiply your seed, greatly multiply your seed, exceedingly multiply your seed, that it shall not be numbered for multitude. She's in good company. She receives a very similar promise to that of Abraham. Now I want you to hear something else in this that you may have read through a little too quickly. Isaac is always referred to as Abraham's seed, right? God is talking to Hagar. Women who were property, especially this woman being property in that situation, God says to her, this is your seed, not Abraham's. Did you see that? She's your child. And I'm going to bless this child. He's going to have multitudes of heirs, descendants. Her seed, just like the Abrahamic promise. Noteworthy, this is the only woman to receive such a divine promise. Think about that. It's written down for us all those many years that we're reading it now. In 2022, he says this woman has been given a divine promise that her child would have great lineage. Great, multiplied lineage. God elevated Hagar, promised her Ishmael would be a healthy and productive child. Innumerable. Verse 11, God's knowledge is on display here. He puts this in here for a reason. This conversation is here to remind her who he is. What do you mean? I don't know how expecting she was, how much she was showing and so forth. Abram and Sarah knew that she was with child. They understood that, but it doesn't really tell us at this point. I know that 10 years they had been waiting on a child, and this situation happens with Hagar, but how long it took for her to leave, how far along is she in the pregnancy, we don't know for sure about that, but God says, you are with child. But not only say you're with child, the only one that could know this is way before sonograms, and they're not always 100%, right? You're going to have a male child. I see you. That's what God's saying. I know you. And you're going to call his name Ishmael. Which means, of course, God hears or God has heard. God knows you have been mistreated. That's the idea. He's saying to her, I know that you have been mistreated. But then he goes on in verse 12 and talks about the character and destiny of this one that would be born to her. The idea here of being a wild man, some translations put the word donkey in there. But it really is fitting more so of a wild horse than it is just a donkey. We think maybe donkey because they're known to be a little bit more stubborn, I guess. But the idea of being a wild horse that's unable to be tamed. The character and destiny presence is better translated here, though in the latter part of that as defiance as well. Excuse me, he will dwell in defiance of his people more so than presence. And you'll see this fulfilled later on in Genesis chapter 26, verse 18. But one commentary wrote this concerning Ishmael's character, said Ishmael would likewise be a wild man resisting civilization and social conventions. He would have a haughty, defiant attitude and refuse to adjust to society. He would live as everyone's enemy, refusing to fit in, and everyone would perceive him in that way. It's going to be rough. Just like a wild Mustang. You try to throw a rope around his neck and he throws you. Right? That was Ishmael, his descendants. And so the Ishmaelites, we've heard about them many times, and you recall toward the end of the book in Genesis chapter 37, verses 25 through 28, also Genesis 39, verse 1. A band of Ishmaelites come along when they're trying to deal with who? Joseph. The brothers wanted to kill him. Judah says, oh, what good is going to kill us? Let's sell him. We'll get some profit out of this. Let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. They were traffickers. Wild. Other examples we can see later on, but let's move on. Look at verse 13. Hagar realized something. The word here in the original referencing God is Yahweh. You may have heard that one before. And she hears this idea that Yahweh hears. Jehovah we hear sometimes in the concept. But it's an elevating of who he is. And there in verse 11, he hears. But now in verse 13, not only does he hear, he sees me. Take her hopeless situation that she's really right in the woods. Now he sees me. He cares for me. Likely she had heard Abram speak of Yahweh as being his God, and now this angel that she sees, the angel of the Lord, which will view that, the idea is he's saying the same word. This is Yahweh. He sees me. He hears me. He's taking care of me. So the end result of that is better translated in the New American Standard Version than it is in the King James Version. The last result of that is she says, have I even remained alive after seeing you? How can I live seeing God? So she didn't see this as an angel being some messenger. She saw this as Yahweh. She saw this presence as God. Genesis 32 and verse 30 says, and Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. That was not normal. They had in the mind and the concept, you see God, you die. And they can see God and live. So Hagar's situation reminds us that we serve a God who's willing to help those who feel as though they have no help. The place, Bir Lahira, is the well of the living one who sees me. Aren't you glad that God still sees us? Then finally, and I know our time is running short, Abram thought he had done his part. And that's verses 15 and 16. And Hagar bare Abram a son, and Abram called his son's name, which Hagar bare, Ishmael. And Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bare Ishmael to Abram. Certainly Hagar told Abram about the situation, about what had happened, about her vision, and what she had seen, the instruction. He accepted it, didn't he? How do I know that he accepted that? What did he name the child? Ishmael, just as God had said. Abram must have thought that this is the one. This is the heir. Now, Ishmael being the firstborn ensured that he would be the one of inheritance, right? No. Why? Because Hagar and Sarah and the situation there. Ishmael being the firstborn did not, however, assure him of first inheritance. If Sarah had a son, remember Hagar is still a secondary wife, actually still a servant and a slave. And that wasn't God's plan anyway. It's going to be another 4 years, isn't it? Another 4 years. Sarah is 76, Abram is 86. It's going to be another 4 years before Sarah has their son. Ishmael is not going to be the son of promise. He's going to be cared for. But how often do we put ourselves in the same boat as that of Abraham? It seems like this is the way it's going to work. It seems like I've done my part now. I'm good. We haven't even touched the hem of the garment of what God expects. God is still waiting for us to realize He doesn't need our help. He needs our trust. When we walk with the Lord in the light of His Word, what a glory He sheds on our way. While we do His good will, He abides with us still and with all who will. I heard a little bit of it. I think you know it. Trust and obey. God waited until Abram and Sarah were good as dead. Literally. Well, that's harsh. No, that's what the text says. Go to Hebrews chapter 11. Look at verses 11 and 12. We'll bring it to a close. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 11 and 12. Abram was 100 years old. Good as dead when it comes to having children, right? But what about Sarah? It says in Hebrews 11, verses 11 and 12, through faith, also Sarah herself received strength to conceive seed when was delivered of a child when she was past age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore sprang there even of one, and him, here it is, as good as dead. So many as the stars of the sky and multitude, as the sand which is by the seashore, innumerable. Sarah thought she needed to help God. Hagar thought she had no help. And Abram thought he had done his part. Guess what? They were all wrong. What about you and me? God's will was still accomplished, wasn't it? God's will continue to be accomplished. The question is, does God need our help? No, just our trust. Do you trust Him today? Do you trust Him to save you? Do you trust Him to be your God? Do you trust that He can use you to fulfill His purpose in your life? What is it? Fear God, keep His commandments, the Holy Command. You heard His word, believe it. Trust Jesus as the Son of God. Trust Him with all your heart, soul, and mind, that you're willing to repent of your sins, confess His name, and be baptized for the remission of your sins. You've done those things, and you haven't been trusting Him as you should. You've been leaning on your own understanding. Come back to Him. We're going to sing the song of encouragement. You need to respond. Do so now as we stand.
Again, we're grateful for everybody's presence today. If you're visiting this hour, we'd like for you to fill out an attendance card. You'll find in the songbook right in front of you there, and leave that here with one of us so we can have a record of your visit. A few announcements that were not on the worship guide. Talked to Suzanne, and she says that Ken Pearson has gone home. The surgery was successful, and so far everything is going as they had hoped. So let's continue to remember Ken in our prayers. Got a note that says Brother Liz Hallmark is suffering from a kidney infection right now. That's why they're not here this morning. So let's remember him and his family in our prayers, that he would have a speedy recovery. Don't forget the table in the foyer for the gifts for Chet, and I think it's Malcolm. And then the final announcement is, if you've not partaken of the Lord's Supper today, while we sing the last song, you can go out to the auditorium to the right into the library, and the Lord's Supper is there prepared to be served to you while we sing this song.
If I walk in the pathway of beauty, if I work till the close of the day, I shall see the great King in his beauty. When I walk the last mile of the way, when I go the last mile of the way, I will rest at the close of the day. And I know there are joys that await me when I walk the last mile of the way. Pray with me. Gracious Father in heaven, we thank you for this beautiful day you've given us. We thank you for standing by us up to this very moment. It is a privilege, Father, to be able to come out and do this. Pray that everything we said will be strict according to thy will. Please forgive us of our sins and help us to have a good week and exemplify Christ and the love you have for us. And take this lesson and let us apply it to our everyday lives. Bless in Christ's name.